So hi, everyone. I'm Marcia Nedland. I am one of the organizers for the National Middle Neighborhoods Community of Practice. And today we have a topic that so many of us are really concerned about and trying to sort out, which is about the investor population that seems to be increasingly owning single family homes, perhaps especially in middle neighborhoods. So we're going to talk about how to look at exactly what is going on in your particular neighborhood that you're working in. Well, I'll tell you who's going to talk to us about that in a second. So go ahead, Ann. Before I do that, let me just explain that the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative, for those of you who are new to it, it's a national initiative and it's not that old. I'd say maybe about 8 years old. And it started with a group of practitioners, researchers, policymakers who, through different means, have become concerned about the trajectory of middle neighborhoods and noticed that as we looked at how they were doing over time, that they were sort of faltering in their sustainability. So we're trying to mobilize attention on middle neighborhoods and hopefully get people to start paying attention to the middle neighborhoods in their cities. We're seeing that they're really starting to disappear either through decline or gentrification. So we have a community of practice that does things like these monthly webinars. We participate in research into topics that have relevance to practitioners and policymakers. NCST, who's one of the partner organizations, the other is NeighborWorks America, who are sort of our hosts for this work. NCST does policy analysis and advocacy and communication strategies around the topic. So we have a steering committee of about 20 people. And if by any chance you'd love to be on our steering committee, always let us know. We're always looking for new people who are out there in the field doing stuff that we can involve in guiding this work. So what is a middle neighborhood? I think that's our next slide. Yeah, so just some brief characteristics. We don't have hard and fast metrics about what is and isn't a middle neighborhood, but we generally say that if you think about the place that you live in, these are neighborhoods that are neither the most distressed nor are they the healthiest. So it's all the stuff that tends not to have that much attention paid to it. Perhaps, particularly nobody's tracking long-term indicators about homeownership and who owns what and how housing values are going and things like that. We know that most middle neighborhoods tend to have been built as single-family homes for families with children. It's probably one of the reasons why they're at risk because that tends to be a declining demographic nationally. They tend to be still well more than 50% owner-occupied, but you often see that eroding. The housing stock is aging. It's in acceptable condition, but it often lacks the features and updates to compete well for today's home buyers, unless you're in the recent sort of bidding war on anything kind of situation that we've been in. And one of the things that's really interesting, and I'm starting to poke into a lot more, is that we find that middle neighborhoods tend to be more racially, ethnically, and economically diverse than either their lower income or higher income counterparts, which has a lot of ramifications for how you craft strategy, sort of the range of eligibilities that you need to be thinking about when you're doing strategy and so forth. So that's middle neighborhoods. If you want to take a look at where the middle neighborhoods are in your community, we have one tool at our website, middleneighborhoods.org, and that is a mapping tool that will allow you to toggle some screens on the left-hand side about income range. So this just looks at income range. It is not the only number that you should be looking at it, but can give you a place to start in terms of seeing which census tracts pop up in your community. So who are we talking to today? So we're really lucky to have Alice Mann, who's a friend and a colleague that I work with on some projects. Alice has her own consulting practice, and she lives in Livingston Manor, New York, which is in the Catskills. But she's also lived in New York City for a few years, and as you'll see in a minute, in Syracuse. So I just have to give some of her resume highlights because they're really interesting. She was the housing director for the city of Syracuse, and also an adjunct professor at Syracuse University. And when I think maybe when I first met her, she was the director of neighborhood planning and property redevelopment at Home Headquarters, which is kind of a largish and very high capacity nonprofit in Syracuse, New York. So Alice, one of the things Alice and I have been working on together is some projects where we're helping nonprofits look at some data they might not normally have access to, or have not pursued so far at the neighborhood scale, to see sort of what's going on and to have it help shape how they roll out their neighborhood strategy. So Alice is going to talk to us today. I asked her specifically to talk to us about sort of what we can find out from looking at landlord data, how to find that data, very nuts and bolts for all of us so we could all go and do this. And then what are sort of the roundup on strategies for policy and practice that we're seeing out there today. And then we'll have some time for Q&A as well. So Alice, we're going to let her switch over to her slides. We're so happy to have you, and take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marcia. I'm really excited to be here and excited to share some of the things that we've been learning as Marcia said, we've been working together, doing some research in different neighborhoods, in different markets, in different places in the US. And today we're going to share that information. All right, so let's see. To start us off, it's basically we're going to start by sharing examples of what we can learn by looking at investor owner information on a community level, or looking at it by through a neighborhood lens, what's happening in your community. We're going to provide some tips and tricks on how to access the data, and some tips on how you might want to structure some analysis, like the things that you might want to look at first to learn about what's happening in your community. We're going to talk about the impact of investor-owned properties on the neighborhood. And as you will see, there's probably more questions that we have than answers. So we're going to talk about how you might think about other research questions that relate to the investor data. And then finally, we're going to talk about strategies for how you get the most from what's going on in your community. So just to start, why should we look at investor ownership in your middle neighborhood? I mean, I'm sure there are many reasons, but a couple of the ones that just really came to mind is that not everyone is a homeowner. And I know we use homeownership rates a lot as a kind of a metric, and a kind of hold that up as a defining factor, a piece in your community, but not everyone is a homeowner, and investors do make up different shares of the communities that we're working in. And they're a player in the neighborhood, just like homeowners are, or other key stakeholders. So, it's important to understand who is invested in the community, where they're from, the kind of business model they use, what kind of impacts are their properties having on the community. And that could be everything from looking at home sales information all the way to the conditions of buildings, and understanding where the investors are from and what their stake is. So for this webinar, we're not talking about larger investors or larger in terms of unit count. We're really talking about investors of single family homes. And I have a poll to get us started. I'm curious to know, has your organization analyzed data about landlords or investors in your community? So we have, yes, we regularly analyze data and we look at this information. Maybe you sometimes analyze data. Maybe you're planning to try to get some data, or maybe you haven't and you want to learn more. So let's see here. So it looks like we're getting more and more responses. We almost have everyone. Just about half of the people on the webinar say we sometimes analyze data about landlords and investors. So that's great. This isn't probably going to be new, but I think we're at an interesting point, and it's always interesting to kind of refresh this information. All right. So let's get into it. So the first community, that kind of case study that we're going to look at is in Indianapolis, Indiana. And we did some work analyzing investor ownership in the Far East Side neighborhood. So you can see on the map, the Far East Side is over here, all the way on kind of the outskirts of the city of Indianapolis. It's got about 10,000 people. It is 62% Black African American, 17% white, 21% Hispanic. It's a community that has families. There's a lot of children that live in the neighborhood, particularly compared to, kind of the percentage of children that live across the state. You've got about 3,900 households. 41% of them are owner occupied, 59% are renter occupied, and about 4 out of 5 units are single family homes. And that information comes from the 2020 ACS 5-year estimates. So our analysis goals for this were to really look at property owner information for single family homes, and specifically at investor-owned single family homes, because we wanted to determine who are the investors in this community, how many properties do they own, where are the investors from, and then who are the largest investors in the community in terms of the inventory that they own. And we were able to use some parcel level assessors data, and we'll get into this later with some tips on how you can access this information. But this is really, this is the data this is kind of what you can do with this kind of information. So some of our findings, first of all, we find we have a homeownership rate that I talked about before, and that's based on the number of units in the neighborhood. So 51% of the single family homes parcels in the neighborhood are investor owned. So you've got just over half of single families investor owned. About 23% of the single family homes in the neighborhood are actually owned by people or entities that reside outside the state of Indiana. So you have a considerable amount of properties that are owned by out-of-state investors. And then what we found by looking at investors that own the most properties is you've got 15 investors owning 15% of the single family homes in the neighborhood. And so that totals 460 single family homes are owned by 15 investors. So just to start us off, this is a map where you can see single family homes and which ones are owner occupied and which ones are investor owned. And it's difficult to probably see the legend, but these colors in here, if it has a blue hash mark, those are investor owned single family homes, and those with a pink hash mark, which sort of make the properties look a little orange, are owner occupied homes. So really what you can see from this is that there is quite a mix across this community of owners and investors, and there's quite a mix across the different blocks. It is really a community where some blocks are, like it appears half and half owners and investors. So in terms of examining the top investors in the Far East Side, we said that 15 investors own 15% of the single family homes. And so what we did is we pulled those out and we mapped them. And that's what this map is. The properties that are highlighted in orange, purple, and teal are highlighting those top 15 investors. And in terms of, we started digging around trying to figure out who those investors were, how many properties they own, and we broke them into categories, which I think has been important for this kind of work here. The teal properties are large-scale institutional investors, or they appear to be. And I'll get back to kind of the non-technical definition that we use to determine those. The orange properties are sort of the mom and pop investors. So sometimes those properties were in LLCs, or they had kind of a business name. Other times they were in a person's name or a couple's name. There's no websites, there's no fancy marketing. And then you have the purple, which appeared to be more Indiana-based investors. And they might have a website, like a very low-tech website, or use a Facebook group to advertise available rentals. Really, what you can see here is that this has been a market, a place where all kinds of investors, mom and pop, kind of smaller scale Indiana-based investors, and larger scale institutional investors have chosen to invest. So here was the list of our institutional investors, and there's 6 of them here. So like I said, there's not a technical definition. Some research papers think about institutional investors as investors that own above a certain number of single family homes across their portfolio. For our purposes, they tended to be out-of-state investors. They tended to operate across multiple states. They had fairly sophisticated websites, and I will show some examples of that. And some of them, like Vinebrook Homes, they own 104 properties in this neighborhood. So pretty substantial holdings. Here are some of the websites, just to give a flair for what they look like. The Vinebrook Homes kind of put down roots, find a home that is right for you. You can see on the left, they operate in many markets across the South and the Midwest, and also, in New Mexico, further west too. Another example, this is another entity that owns quite a few in that community, is Conrex Property Management out of Charleston, South Carolina. And like very similarly to Vinebrook Homes, you've got, Find Your Perfect Home. I think that was one thing that struck me as I was researching who these investors were, is the way that they kind of marketed their products. They really it felt as though sometimes they kind of hung on the American dream, put your roots down, find your perfect home. They showed many times, like their photography or stock photography showed Black or minority families together, and they're really thinking about like who they're targeting in their marketing. But this is another example.
One of the things Alice pointed out to me that was really sort of gave me the shivers is that all the messages they're using are basically the same messages that homebuyer education programs use to recruit people to, home ownership.
Yeah, put your roots down. Yeah. There was also, so some of the websites also had pretty easily accessible pages for, like, we buy homes for cash, we pay cash for houses. This is one of the investors that own a sizable number of properties in the Far East Side, SFR3. They're out of New York. And, they're promising, 24-hour decision, 7 days cash payment for your house. And I know in some of the research that's been a fear is that some of the larger entities are really able to pick up properties even times before they go on the market. So properties are never even able to make it to the market because owners can sell very quickly to these entities. As I said before, it's not just the institutional investors that have seen this community as a market, an opportunity in the market to rent single family homes, but there are several kind of more mom and pop investors, as those are the ones that have people's names attached, sometimes LLCs also. And then some of the investor owners that were more local to Indiana, Casas Baratas Aquí, I think they had a Facebook page. Park Property Group and Robert Rentals had like a pretty modest website, but there are others that are operating in the market as well. So I'm curious here. I know that there were some, I don't know if folks from Indiana and Indianapolis had joined us today, but I'm curious about if there is anyone on, what did you guys find most surprising about this information and about the investors in this community?
If we have anyone from Indianapolis, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and just go ahead and talk. I know we had a number of people registered, but I'm not sure if they're here. Okay,
All
well,
right.
if not, we'll move on.
Yeah, I mean, what it came down to, I think, is that this pattern really started raising more questions than answers. So it's one thing to understand the mix of investors in your community, but it really creates a whole bunch of follow-up questions to understand the impact that they have. So kind of out of this, there's, what makes this neighborhood a desirable place for investors to purchase single family homes for rent? We've looked at another community in Indianapolis, and they didn't have any institutional investors purchasing single family homes or owning single family homes in that community. What's the history of the neighborhood? Was it impacted by the foreclosure crisis during the Great Recession? Was there excess inventory at one time? What are the conditions of the investor-owned properties? How do the conditions vary depending on the type of investor or the specific investor owner? And how do they compare to other homes in the community? Are there different, if you're walking down the street, do you see a difference between those that are owned by investors versus owners? What are the home sale price trends in the neighborhood? What are the rent trends? I think those are two important keys to look at. Are evictions an issue? What types of local laws are in place to help protect renters? Are there rental registries? Does it include investors that own single family homes, or does it just include investors that own larger multifamily homes? Are there opportunities for homeowners to purchase homes in the Far East Side if they desire? And can would-be homebuyers still find homes to purchase in the community? And I don't know as though we have answers to those questions.
Alice, I think Jeb is here, Jeb Reese from Intend, Indiana. I saw his hand pop up there for a minute. Are you here, Jeb? And do you need to be, let's see. Oh, here, I'll hit allow to talk. Maybe that'll help. There we go.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I was just going to say that one of the things that surprised me about the research was looking at the tax addresses, so like where the tax bill is being sent. I don't know if this was specific to the Far East Side or if it was one of the other neighborhoods that we worked in, but just kind of, on the surface, it doesn't seem like a certain investor owns very many properties in a neighborhood, but then when you look at where the tax bill is going, they own several LLCs that make up the lion's share of investor-owned properties in that neighborhood. And to me, I thought that was a really interesting and powerful tool that we had not thought of up until this point.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Jeb. I think Alice is going to talk about that. And Alice, we had a little question here. Maybe you could address, which is Ariel asked, how would you be able to answer the question about the foreclosure crisis impact? Like what data would you look at to know whether a neighborhood had been impacted by foreclosure?
That's a good question. The place I might start is talking to people on the ground in the community to try to understand, like locally, what is known about the history of the neighborhood. In terms of sometimes I'm thinking about foreclosure data. There might be, if you're looking at historical home sales, there might be some indications of maybe homes sold like well below market or what they had been selling for. So you can kind of track those sales trends. And then, in New York, sometimes you can request data like Liz Pendens filed over a period of time by address to understand which homeowners were at risk of foreclosure. But, I think it's kind of piecemeal, and it might be best to start with somebody who has some historical context of the neighborhood to talk about it.
Yeah, it always has been the case, I think, that the data, there isn't like a national source of data on this really. And so it's funny to me, as I was thinking about that question, Alice, that, 2008 was actually a long time ago. So,
Yeah.
plenty of people working in our industry who were not working in our industry in 2008. It used to be so obvious. But I'll bet if you started talking to like bank partners or city government partners, there are going to be people who were really paying attention at the time and could tell you whether, which places in the community were particularly impacted by foreclosure. And then there's just some general things that we know. For example, that Black households were absolutely disproportionately impacted by foreclosure. This was, I think, the sort of Black middle class was probably one of the hardest hit subgroups by foreclosure because of the kinds of loans that they'd been targeted with. But yeah, talk to someone local in your community who was around in 2008, and anyone in the lending industry, and possibly anyone who, the year the property went from owner occupant to investor owned. Yeah, that would be, it just might be kind of complicated. You might not need to know that level of detail, but.
Yeah, I think there's a question too about how you track the LLCs that are owned by more than one or by one entity. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But as Jeb indicated, you can kind of track where tax bills are sent. And it's another indicator that you can see how many different LLCs go to the same tax bill. All right. We're going to move on here. This is another neighborhood that we've done some work in, and this was kind of a different approach. So this is Boca Club. It's more Boca Club, probably target area than neighborhood. It's a very small community near Lake Man in Orlando, Florida. There's about 250 residential properties. Most of them are single family homes. The bright green that you see kind of going across the center of that community are kind of larger multi-family properties. And there are fewer than 1,200 households. So again, very small area in the city of Orlando. And here our analysis goals were a little bit different. We were actually working with an organization to analyze home sale trends in that small community. And we wanted to compare what was happening with home sale trends in that target area to kind of the trends overall happening in Orlando. And also wanted to get an idea of who were buying and selling homes in the Boca Club target area. So for this, we used some sales data that was, we were able to download from Orange County, Florida's real property website. And it included all home sales for Orange County, Florida between 2018 and 2022. So we had about a 5-year spread of home sales data. And what was pretty awesome about this data set that was publicly available is that it had information on grantor and grantee. So we could really see who was the seller and who was the buyer in the home sales. So here are some of our findings. Home sale prices are on the rise in both the Boca Club target area and in Orlando overall. And I think the key takeaway in sort of the sales trends was to learn that prices in Boca Club compared to average prices in Orlando were still, lower. So median home sale price in 2022 was $191,000 in Boca Club compared to $432,000 in the city of Orlando. But prices are rising faster in Boca Club than they are in Orlando overall. This is a map. This is a map of home sales, and every dot indicates one home sale. It is of all the home sales from 2018 through 2022. And in the center is the Boca Club target area, and then kind of zoomed out it's zoomed out so you can sort of see what's happening, not just in that neighborhood, but sort of in the context of a larger place. And the colors in this map represent the price per square foot of the sale, and they're divided into quintiles. So to give you an idea, the yellow dots represent sales that are part of the bottom 20% of sales in terms of price per square foot countywide. So those are the lowest home sale prices, whereas the dark blue represent the top 20% of home sales countywide. And it's, you know, putting things in quintiles like that is a great way to look at some of this data, so you can kind of get a feel for you know, where your target area falls within a larger context, and for this case, countywide sales. You can see, you know, most of the sales inside of Boca Club are yellow, and there's a couple of greens, which mean they fall kind of in the middle quintiles of all home sales countywide. So because we're really focused on what was happening in that community, we did a deep dive into the 49 sales that occurred in the 5-year period. And this is, I think this was kind of remarkable. So what we found was, of the 49 sales, 22 of those sales out of the 49 we considered flips. And when we say flips, we mean the same property was sold 2 and sometimes 3 times between 2018 and 2022, every time for more money. So there were 10 properties involved in those 22 sales. Of the 10 properties that were flipped, the average price increase of the flips were $122,000. There was actually one flip that was purchased for $70,000 and resold for $270,000 about 6 months after the initial purchase. So it was interesting to sort of track those properties. It appeared some work was going into them to warrant higher home sale prices. And then we started tracking, of those 10 flips, we were trying to understand who was buying them. And 4 of them ended up being sold to owner occupants, and 6 of them were sold to investors, 3 to institutional investors, who are those kind of larger multi-state companies. 2 of them were sold to investors in Orlando, and 1 was sold to an investor in California. So, you know, I mean, I think this brings up, you know, a lot of questions, but here, the Boca Club target area is pretty small. We felt like it was important to try to understand what was happening broader. We know prices have been rising rapidly. LLCs and investors were buying homes to fix up and flip, and the end buyers were not all homeowners. Some of the institutional investors were Tiber Capital and Amherst Residential. I think Amherst appears to be one of the big ones out of Texas. Tiber's out of I think DC. And with this data, one of the big questions was, where else in Orlando are those entities purchasing homes? So this map shows every star is a home purchase that was either made by Tiber Capital or Amherst Residential over the last 5 years, from 2018 to 2022. So you can start to see the area at Boca Club definitely has several homes that were recently purchased by these investors. And the area to like the south and the west seems to be an area that those investors are targeting purchasing properties as well. We also have to, I mean, we're only looking at 2 investors, so you also have to imagine they're probably not the only ones in the market. Also, you know, in speaking with some of the folks on the ground in Orlando, they went out and did some property condition surveys, looking at the homes in the Boca Club area, and really found that the homes that the investors were purchasing looked as good and sometimes even better than the owner occupied homes. So it's interesting to see kind of on the ground, understand what the property conditions looked like.
I think it's interesting, Alice, it was your work in Orlando that made me realize that zooming out to see sort of the citywide impact of particular investors could be really valuable. So we kind of, are working under the impression that they have algorithms, they have a set of criteria for what kind of property they want to buy. And so it's not surprising that you'll see their purchases concentrated in some neighborhoods and no purchases in other neighborhoods. And I think if I were in the city government level, I'd really be wanting to look at citywide where these investors were popping up and think about, potentially learning a lot more about their intentions and their business practices and sort of developing some kind of a plan about what, relationship building or some other strategies that I'll also talk about in a minute.
Yeah, thanks for that point, Marcia. That it seems to be in neighborhoods where there's a lot of yellow, which indicate lowest home sales, compared to the whole county. And then some of the middle, like the green colored, which are sort of the middle quintiles. And there were no stars that appeared in the areas with the highest home sales, which is probably not surprising if you're familiar. All right, so again, more questions, I think, than answers, but how large of a market share do institutional investors have in the entire single family home market in the neighborhoods near Boca Club? I mean, again, we were just using sales data, so we were not looking at all investor owners and all investor owned properties. I'd also be curious to know how homeownership rates have changed over the last 10 years in these neighborhoods. Are homeowners competing with institutional investors to purchase? Are institutional investors flipping homes to themselves to establish higher comps? And this was like really interesting, a handful, three of the flipped purchases were the end purchaser was an institutional investor at a higher cost than what somebody purchased the home for. So it just raised some questions about who's flipping and how they have access to those homes. Is it a subsidiary of one of those companies? I really don't know, but it would be interesting to learn more about how kind of that is working on the ground. And, what are they charging in rents? You can kind of go on to some of their websites and see what they're renting available properties for, but, it's harder to see their entire inventory and what they charge. All right, before I go on to the next one, I just thought I would pause. I don't know if there's any questions or anything coming up.
We did have a question that I think you're going to be addressing later, which is, can you identify sort of vulnerabilities in the market before you wake up and see that, half of your stock is owned by investors? And I think you are going to address that later. And then Anna just put a question in that I think Alice is about to go answer right now. Anna, how do you track the LLCs that are all owned by one entity? So she's about to move into how to get this data and look at it. And it's actually quite simple.
Well, I'm going to talk about one more neighborhood,
okay.
And this is a little bit different. This is some work I did about 5 years ago in a neighborhood in Rochester, New York. And the reason I say it's different is, in Indianapolis and Orlando are sort of the Sun Belt, the Midwest markets. And in terms of institutional investors and what you hear about them, those are neighborhoods and places that those investors have targeted. Rochester, New York also has a lot of single family homes that are investor owned. But the market, at least 5 years ago when we were doing work, was a little bit different. So this is a community where this is a map here About 70% of the residential parcels in this neighborhood are single-family homes. Just over half of those single-family homes are owner-occupied, and you see those in blue on the map. So, you know, just under half of the homes are investor-owned, still a pretty sizable proportion. And about 5% of the single-family homes are vacant. And this is not just vacant, you know, transition vacant, this is vacant and abandoned. So our analysis here was really to understand, you know, what investors own the most homes in the neighborhood. Are the investors invested in other communities across the city, and to really understand the condition of those homes. And all under kind of the umbrella that oftentimes in our communities, the impact that investor-owned properties have on the neighborhood depend on the level of upkeep and maintenance of their homes, depend on the quality of the rental units, and depend on the quality of the tenant screening that might happen. So we were diving in to, again, some parcel level assessors data and pairing it with information on outstanding code violations and vacant structures. So what we found in this neighborhood here were there were 6 owners, property owners that each of them owned 15 or more properties in that neighborhood. One of the property owners was the housing authority. So owner 4 was the public authority. But of the 5 owners that had the largest inventory, 4 out of those 5 investors owned properties in the neighborhood with multiple code violations. 2 out of those 5 owned properties in the neighborhood that were vacant. One of them owned 2 vacant properties, and again, vacant, abandoned. And these 5 investors that owned, you know, just over 100 properties collectively, you know, they owned a sizable number of other properties across Rochester. So one of them here, you know, owned 202 properties across the city. And so I think in terms of this community, what it really meant is that there had to be a strategy developed for figuring out how to reinforce and support the neighborhood-friendly investors that were in the community, and how to think about creating stability through long-term quality rental housing, and not just focusing on owner occupancy, because rental housing is half the neighborhood. We talked a little bit about business models and maybe understanding the business models of different investors. And this was something that was published by Lisk, and it was really thinking about the business models of investors that end up with distressed properties, and what they could do with that. And so sometimes using kind of a typology to understand the types of investors that you're working with can be another way and another lens to help figure out the kinds of strategies that might be best to address the issues, and what the motivations of those investors are. All right. So we're going to move on to where to get data to analyze property ownership in your neighborhood. So when I say where to get data, we're going to give you some pointers on how to access assessors data. Assessors data is kind of collected and maintained for tax purposes. It provides detailed information about every parcel of land in your locality. You can join it to a parcel map to show information geographically. And in many localities, this data is available in some form publicly. Assessors data also, there's different information that's collected. Different states have different requirements. So you'll notice that in different places, you can often access, slightly different fields or different pieces of information. But across the US, many places have access to this core data. And here's an idea of some of the common fields of information most of the time assessor's data has. It'll have a parcel ID or a section, block, and lot number. And those are important because it can help show that information geographically. It'll have information on the property address. It might have information on land use or use code. Sometimes it has information about zoning also. It could have information about year built. There are some places that also include other building characteristics, like, you know, numbers of beds and baths and things like that in a property. It also includes the owner name, the owner address, and the owner city, state, and zip code. And that's often where tax bills are sent. And those are going to be some important fields that we use to analyze investor-owned data. Oftentimes there's also assessed values, so you can understand maybe what the land value or the total assessed value is. And sometimes you'll even find recent property sale information, so you could see maybe the last time that property was sold and for what price. So in working with assessors data for many years, I've noticed over the past few years, a lot of places have this data more readily available. And you're even seeing more rural localities digitizing their records. So, you know, there are places in South Dakota where I think 5 or 6 years ago, we weren't able to get this data digitally. And, you know, a year or two ago we were. So it's exciting to see that happen. More and more of it is becoming available. So how to get it? Like I said, more and more of it is becoming available. I think the first thing you want to do is really figure out which avenue probably works best for you and your organization. You know, you might want to find the right person to ask. So this is, you know, somebody at a city, town, or county's assessor's office, where you're able to ask them to compile this information for you. Could also be somebody in a local planning department or maybe even a regional planning agency that has access to this information. If you don't have relationships or you're not, you know, for whatever reason, you think that it would be easier, you can oftentimes find information available publicly. And so the way that I've actually found it in a lot of locations is navigating through a county's GIS department's website. Some GIS websites even allow you to draw your target area and export a CSV or Excel file of the parcel data right from their website. Again, everyone's a little bit different, but it's worth looking to see if that's something that's sort of the low-hanging fruit, easily accessible. The data is also available for purchase. And there's an organization or business that's been compiling sort of a nationwide parcel data set. And they have this information available in a lot of places across the country. What's nice about when you buy data from them is that they have sort of a standard set of fields that they sort and organize all of the local data in, so that if you are looking at a couple different places, everything is it's very standardized, I should say. It's easier to sort of navigate. I have this is Regrid. This is one of the things you go on and you can pay for, but this is one of their functions that they have that I have a free account and I've been able to do. So if you zoom into your city, I zoomed into a neighborhood in Syracuse, which I know these neighborhoods pretty well, and they will list all the top owners in your locality. And I just clicked on Coral Real Estate right here. They own 58 properties, and you could click on any of the owners and all the properties that the owners under that owner name light up, which is that's a pretty cool resource, again, to go on. You can play with it for free. As somebody mentioned, Coral Real Estate LLC might have a bunch of properties owned under another LLC, and it could be the same person. So this doesn't show everyone, it's not, this just shows what Coral Real Estate LLC owns, but it's a good place to start. So tips for requesting data. if you're looking at data for your neighborhood, which is sort of the lens that we've been working through, you could send a map, you could send boundaries, and request the information specifically for the target area you're looking at. You can also ask about the specific fields that you want. And like I said, there's a list earlier of different fields that are often available. And for understanding investor ownership, understanding the owner's address and where the tax bills are sent are really important. You can ask for the data in a CSV file or Excel. And even sometimes you could send a data shell, which is really just a blank Excel spreadsheet that highlights the fields that you're interested in. Another great tip is to ask for a data dictionary or a code book. Sometimes when this information comes in, they might include a field of land use and all you see is a bunch of numbers. So if they can include a code book, it takes some time away from deciphering what the numbers mean. And through all of your analysis, you want to make sure you kind of keep or capture and make sure you request the parcel ID and SBL, because even if you don't have the ability to map it back to a parcel file, without that, it becomes harder to kind of map at a parcel level with a parcel file. So keeping that is good.
And you may someday find somebody to map it for you if you don't have anybody right now.
Yes.
What does SBL stand for, Alice?
Section, block, and lot. Yep. Another tip, for anybody who is thinking they want to look at data larger than just your neighborhood, so for the whole city or the whole county, you of course can ask for information at a higher level. And there are resources like Geocodio, which is a geocoding software. It's all online. You can drop a spreadsheet in there and it can geocode all your addresses or geotag each address with the census tract it falls in. And if you have the census tracts, it gets down at a pretty local level without needing to map it. So it's a good tip if you're thinking broader. So here's some analysis tips for a neighborhood level analysis. And I'm going to just kind of walk through what we did in Indianapolis and even in Rochester. Usually the first thing is identify which properties in your spreadsheet are single family homes. So a field like land use or use code will have that information. Sometimes there's a field of number of units and you can kind of isolate the properties that have one unit or single family homes. The second thing would be like, let's make a guesstimation on all your single family homes, which ones are owner occupied and which ones are investor. One of our tips for that is to compare the address of the property to the address of where the tax bills are sent or the owner address. And so if they are the same, we will guesstimate that it is an owner. It's not perfect, but it can help give us an idea as we go through this analysis. I'll also mention that we know in some rural communities that don't have postal routes, using that method won't work because even owners might have PO boxes. So another option could be to ask the assessor's office to include any homeowner tax exemptions as a field. So in New York State, that might be the STAR exemption. And then we could guesstimate that people with a STAR exemption would be homeowners. You then want to sort of isolate your investor-owned properties so you can sort and focus on those properties that are investor-owned. Number 4 would be taking that list of all the investor owns and group them by the owner's mailing address. If you've never used a pivot table, you should YouTube how to do it because it will change your life. It makes sorting through huge data sets a lot easier. But this way you're able to capture the owner's mailing address and see all of the different LLCs or property owners that might be listed that are having their tax bills sent to that address. And then 5 is, you start making your lists and you do some research on who those investors are in your community. And you might decide to look at the 10 largest landholders. You might decide to look at the 20 largest landholders. You know, you'll see the numbers and you'll figure out what makes sense. In Rochester, the top 6 investors were people that own 15 or more properties. In Indianapolis, 15 investors seem to be a good look on looking at the investors that own a sizable number of properties. So I have an example here. This is you know, a little screenshot of the pivot table that I used in Indianapolis. And here you have 3 Cordis Street. There's 19 properties associated with that mailing address, and there's about eight different names recorded. So you can see that those Conrex Residential Property Group had, you know, 5 different owners with different numbers and different things. So being able to pick it up by owner address allows you to capture all of those in one group. And then, as another example, with kind of a quick Google search of Conrex Residential Property Group, you can see that they were one of the first things that popped up. Not every owner is going to have a clear website. You can also look for where the investors are located. You can do some searches for how many other homes they own in the city or town. And then if you have information on code violations or tax delinquency or vacancy, you can like cross-reference some of that information as well. And finally, once you do your analysis, if you have mapping capability, you can look at it geographically and see if there are any patterns or anything interesting that arises in the data that you've analyzed. All right, and pause for questions before we get into some strategies.
I'll just throw in an anecdote that one of the real estate development people that we're showing that map to, the quadrant of the neighborhood that she had been trying to acquire property in. She looked at this map and said, "Oh, no wonder I'm having trouble acquiring any property there." So it's another reason why, you know, if your strategy is built on, say, acquisition rehab, then who the competition is can be a big determining factor in whether it's a successful strategy or not, whether you're actually able to implement it. It's one of the reasons why it's nice to at least know what's going on in the community you're working in.
Absolutely. All right. There's no other questions. I'm going to kind of keep going.
Go ahead.
So exploring the impact of investor-owned properties on the neighborhood, and really what this turned into is a lot of other research questions to ask, which we've talked about some of them so far. You know, what we do know in terms of recent research trends, investor purchases of single-family homes has increased kind of nationwide since the Great Recession. And a lot has been written about that rise. We know that particularly those purchases seem to happen in certain markets in the South and the Midwest. And it seems to be happening within specific markets in those communities. There's not really a standard definition around different types of investors. It makes it hard to sort of track the exact trends nationally when you think about that. But we know that overall investor purchases, not just institutional investors, have been on the rise. Investors tend to purchase homes with certain square footage or certain year built, and it probably varies a bit by the type of community. And there hasn't been a lot of impact so far written on the impact that investor purchases has on neighborhoods. I think most recently we saw a piece in the Housing Solutions Lab that started to address that. And really explore what some of the existing research is saying about the impact on communities. And overall, it seems that the data is pretty mixed. It seems like there perhaps are pros and cons at the same time. And so really, like, what does this mean for your neighborhood? What that comes back to is that knowing the investor ownership landscape in your community can help you develop a nuanced set of strategies and outcomes that are going to work best for the mix of investors you have. And I think that doing the local research, it sort of comes back to that's a really important point, because it's going to impact what happens at a larger scale might not be the case of what's going on in your community. So on the next couple slides here, I'm going to frame some research questions and with some ideas on other resources and other ways that you might answer some of these questions paired with the investor information if you choose to go and gather it. Kind of one clump of questions seems to be around neighborhood market. So kind of what makes your neighborhood attractive to investors? What is that business model of the landlords that are in your community? How does an investor market their rental properties in your neighborhood? What would happen to the property if an investor hadn't bought it? Do you have a sense that the property was in the condition that would attract a homeowner? Or is the market in your community strong enough that a homeowner would want it? And, you know, in some of those cases where investors own a substantial share and certain investors own a lot of properties, what happens if an investor decides to sell their inventory? I think that's a big question mark. You know, do they unload an entire inventory of 100 properties? And what does that look like? So some of these things probably can be answered, or you can look at demographic trends. You can look at things like tenure by age of householder and income spans in the community, household and family composition. You can research how investors are marketing to potential tenants. Are there physical signs? Is it all online? And you can kind of get a sense for the types of properties that investors are looking to purchase. Another sort of set of questions might be around property sales. So understanding, paired with your investor owners, similar to what we did with Orlando, what are the recent single family home sale price trends that are occurring? Who is buying the properties? Are properties being flipped? To what extent are investors purchasing properties before they even go on the market? I'm not sure how I would answer that one, but there might be some ways to compare maybe MLS data with, you know, county assessors' sales information for every sale transaction. I'm not sure. What types of properties do investors buy? Are there certain like bed bath configurations or square footage, or are they elderly owned properties that are being scooped up by investors? I think those are really interesting things to dive into. And you can look at, you could try to obtain sales data. You can also talk to your local real estate agents. You can understand what they're seeing in the market. And eventually, if you get to know some of the investors in your community, you can talk to them and understand from their perspective what they're seeing and what their property managers are seeing. I think, you know, oftentimes in a lot of communities, fears that investor-owned properties are not as maintained as owner properties. I feel like I hear that a lot. It comes up a lot. So really getting a handle on property conditions, maintenance, and upkeep. So what are the exterior conditions of properties in your communities? Are properties well maintained? Are they attractive? To what extent do properties have code violations or are vacant and abandoned? And how does the exterior condition of investor-owned properties compare to that of owner-occupied properties? I mean, a lot of this might be, you know, physically being in the community and observing some properties, or doing like block condition surveys. or working with the city or town offices to get information on code violations or vacant property listings. I think finally, like another really big set of questions is how are tenants impacted? And that can be anything from what are the rent price trends in the neighborhood? What are the eviction trends? Are there different eviction rates by different investors or types of investors? And how protected are your renters in your community? And lastly, we're going to kind of talk through some strategies, like how can you get the most from your mix of investors and landlords? So for communities that have if you do an analysis and you find your community that has a bunch of institutional investors, the big investors that have lots of properties and are targeting single family homes and own properties all over a bunch of states, what are the opportunities to do relationship building? Can you develop a relationship with the property management in your area? Can you pull them into a strong partnership with the community or the neighborhood association? And are there opportunities to maybe even seek funding? You know, a lot of those big investors have social corporate responsibility arms or corporate giving sections on their websites. And it would be interesting to know what kind of local partnerships could be developed in communities where they have a sizable investment. There's also the part about learning about their plans and their business models. You know, what is their target market? What are their rents? And what are their long-term plans? You know, when they want to sell, how much do they own? Could working with them through working with them, could you create, you know, a managed disposition if they decide to unload their properties? And how might you, as an organization, think about who could be the end buyer of properties if there was a disposition that was to take place? I think for a neighborhood with a lot of the kind of mom and pop landlords, some of the strategies might be providing or promoting training around property management issues. I think it's important when you think about the mom and pop landlords, you know, oftentimes it's their livelihoods that are tied up in the properties, and that, you know, they want to see themselves succeed because they would often earn living from their investment properties. So, you know, training, you know, whether it's crime prevention and policing or information on ways to make property improvements, like maybe energy improvements, or low cost rehab strategies, or how to do tenant recruitment and better manage tenants. You might think about how you can make landlords eligible for loan products for rehab, and how you might consider developing a loan product with landlords in mind or investors. And then, you know, another strategy might be convening a group of local landlords for something like a quarterly lunch. So you can discuss a topic, you could use it as an opportunity to strengthen relationships between your organization and the group of landlords or investors in your community, and also use it as an opportunity for problem solving among the group. You know, we want landlords to succeed in providing safe and decent and affordable housing in our communities.
I see, by the way, when convening groups of landlords, one of the interesting things that seems always to happen is that the landlords who are really great property managers and you know, have nice looking properties and so forth, they sort of start to police, is maybe a strong word, but sort of hold accountable the less wonderful landlords when they're in a group like that. So always I'll see one of the least acceptable landlords say something like, well, you know, I can't do anything about the way the property looks on the outside. That's up to the tenants. I can't do anything about that. And I don't have to say a word. Another one of the investors or property managers will say, that's not true. I own yada, yada, yada properties and this is what I do and so forth. So they can start to hold each other accountable and come up with ideas for each other as well.
Such a great point. And I also know investors in different markets that have worked together. It might have been two of the investors that were more neighborhood friendly, helping to purchase properties from someone who was bringing down the neighborhood or wasn't as a responsible of an investor. So another piece or strategy lens could be to prevent and slow investor purchases. And this might be like learning the price range, the layout, the conditions of homes that investors are buying, and then think about how you create a strategy that can shrink that inventory of homes. I know Marcia has a great example of a program where a neighborhood developed, was it a half bath program, where they provided some architectural services to owners to add a half bath to their homes. And the idea being that they discovered that investors were much more likely to purchase homes with like 3-bedroom and 1 bath, where homeowners weren't as interested in those homes. And if they could help owners add a half bath, they were much more likely to be desirable homes for owners to purchase at the end of the day. Kind of along similar lines, like an heir property program that might incentivize rehab of a property before sale, or helping to, reach out to older homeowners to make sure repairs are there, or also to resolve title issues to avoid heir property problems when you go to sell a home. And also, it could be something fun, like hosting a seminar for those in the neighborhood that are considering to sell their homes. How would you get top dollar for your home? What are the kinds of things you could do? Are there ways to sort of funnel that group of people away from putting their address on a website where it's we pay cash for houses, and help them promote how to sell their home for top dollar in their community? Finally, there's advocacy and policy work. And this seems to be, when you think about kind of the levers of strategy, thinking more broad and how you advocate for policies that can help strengthen probably not only your community, but other communities as well, as it becomes really important. So on a local policy, advocating for rental registries and code enforcement policies that are kind of equitable across communities. Tenants' rights policies and just cause eviction policies. There's some great resources that have best practices for what communities across the country have done in this realm. I think PolicyLink has some resources, Center for Community Progress. It's worth checking out, what ways can you advocate at the local level to have things in place that help really better the conditions in neighborhoods. And then I'm adding in the collection of high quality data. There are still pieces of information that are hard to come by. Things like really tracking what local or what rents are doing. And are there ways that you can advocate for better data collection, or for somebody to be collecting some local data to better understand what are rents, what are investor owners purchases looking like in your community? Are you tracking them over time? And have that be an area where you can sort of track trends so you can see what's coming and what's happening before it already has taken place. So what are your, yeah.
By the way, Alice, we know that Minneapolis has a pretty elaborate database, that high quality data at the local level.
Yes.
That'll be one of the resources we send out in a follow-up email, but they have like a interactive map database so people can really look at what's going on. I can't say for sure whether it's at the census tract level or not, so I haven't scrutinized it lately, but we'll give you that tool to play with. So if any of you feel like you could really have some leverage with your city government about developing a tool that everybody could use, that could be useful. Kenyatta, yeah, I think, yeah, we are recording and we're going to send you everyone a follow-up email that has the link to the recording as well as the slide deck, as well as a list of other resources. Sorry, Alice, go ahead.
No, I figured I'd end today with, if you guys want to share any strategies that you use in the neighborhoods that you work in for working with investors. I'm kind of reading through some of the questions here. Do you have any advice for identifying potential investors in real-time housing sales? My first instinct is to try to talk to people in the community, talk to other investors. In my prior work in Syracuse, a lot of the investors that did sort of neighborhood level investment all knew each other and talked and really had their fingers on the pulse of who was looking to buy what. In terms of like doing it more broadly or at a city level, I'm not sure how you'd capture would-be investors.
But I think that's really actually a great suggestion, Alice, is it doesn't take very many questions or meetings for you to figure out who the big investors are in town. Talk to anybody at code enforcement or talk to the tax assessor or whatever. People are going to know. And even talking, so that's one level at understanding who the investors are and then getting someone to set up a meeting for you so you can ask them some questions. I've also had a lot of success at talking to realtors, which I think Alice mentioned before. I just asked them what are investors looking to purchase versus owner occupants, or what properties do you have listings for that you tend to market specifically to investors because you don't think owner occupant buyers are going to be interested in them. I think we had someone here from Danville, Virginia. That was the first time in my career that I ever had a realtor. Like, it was such a light bulb moment. I was at a sales meeting of a real estate brokerage and talking to them about what we were doing. And they just said, oh, if it's one bath home, we don't even bother showing it to owner occupant buyers. We only show it to investors. And that was such an earth-shaking revelation to me. Oh, Kenyatta, I'm really glad that this will help redirect some of your efforts. I hope that what you guys get out of this is that the first step is to at least understand what's going on in the neighborhood. And once you get your arms around that, I mean, the level of data that Alice pulled together for Indianapolis for that particular neighborhood, you could then easily map out a little research plan, like, okay, what are the top, 5 research questions we have about those investor-owned properties? Like, chief to me would be, what condition are they in? What are their intentions and business models, which might mean talking to the investors themselves, going out and doing some observations to get building conditions, and just start talking to people and showing them your mapped data and hearing what other people who are involved in housing in your community know already about this or think about it. It can start to build up a little community of people who are trying to run down what's happening. And then as you learn things, it'll become clearer what could be a set of strategies. Maybe you have some investors who are actually not bad for the neighborhood and some who are terrible. How can you support the good ones and work with the good ones, even to think about strategies to get rid of the bad ones? When, we've started to see some articles that investors at the national level are kind of cooling their jets about acquisitions because of rising interest rates. Well, that sort of begs the question then, are they going to start selling, and who are they going to sell to? Could it be you if you're a nonprofit, or could you sort of facilitate having one of the better investors in the community who's maybe willing to flip to owner occupants be the takeout investor. You know, there's a whole lot of things you can do to shape what happens, even if you can't control everything.
Such a great way to put it, like focusing on responsible disposition. If it comes to that, right? Like, how do you massage that?
Yeah. So, feel free to keep typing anything in if you have strategies, but maybe Anne, you want to flip into our closing slides. I would also encourage any of you, my email address is Marcia, MARCIA @middleneighborhoods.org. We would love to hear what you do with this. Anything you find out at all adds to the knowledge that we can all have and share with each other. I encourage you, if you're not already a member of our community practice, to please join. If you look at middleneighborhoods.org at the bottom of any page, there's a place to sign up for that. There's about to be a shakeup of where our website is, but I don't think it's happened yet. So upcoming events that we're doing include our next webinar, which is with Alan Malik. Probably most of you have heard of him or know him, and he is going to talk about his new book, and then which is about shrinking cities around the world, and then what he thinks are the implications of shrinking cities for middle neighborhoods in particular, and what we can all do as practitioners and policymakers to sort of prepare for that and start to, sort of think long-term about some strategies that will respond to long-term trends around populations. And then the next day, July 19th, Anne will be leading an engagement chat. We have those on a regular basis. And this one is going to talk about community cleanups, and we'll have special guests talking about that, about what they've done from Baton Rouge and Great Falls. I know in Baton Rouge, I think what they're going to talk about is cleaning up a cemetery that actually resulted in learning a whole lot of history about the neighborhood and all of that. So it's just really interesting. And Great Falls always does amazing stuff with engaging residents. And finally, we like to always promote one of our partners, the Center for Community Progress. They run a webinar series that's very good. It's called the Cornerstone Webinar Series. So check them out. And you may remember Alice mentioned that they're a really great resource for rental registry information, like what they are, how to develop them, what are some case studies, etc. And we're going to send you out an evaluation after this. We actually really do look at what you suggest for future webinars. So please mention that if you have follow-ups. And as it happens, Anne, who you can't see, but who's moving the slides around and stuff, Anne is the person who produces our webinars and also writes up our best practices, which she's often writes up a best practice to capture what happens in one of our webinars, and she is going to be working on one of those today. I think she mentioned it in the chat, and she's even going to try creating some kind of a worksheet to help you develop a local sort of mini research approach to analyzing your landlords. So if there's nothing else, I want to thank Alice for all the work she put into this. She's so good at this stuff. She's so curious, and really, it's so delightful to have someone who understands the big picture, who's been a practitioner, who's been a policymaker, and has GIS skills and research skills. It's amazing. So we know that Alice will keep plugging along and doing more and more stuff that's going to add to the knowledge in the field. And we appreciate you, Alice. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share the stuff we've been working on. And I appreciate everyone who contributed today. So thank you.
Yeah, really remarkable input from everybody. Okay, everyone, have a great day.